Inmate, back in your cell. Everything's under control.
I'm in danger!
You know, I think it's safe to say that survival horror has had a bit of a renaissance lately. I mean, we're getting remakes for the hits like Dead Space, the Resident Evil games, and most recently, Silent Hill 2.
I don't look like a ghost, do I?
And on top of that, we're also getting great indie titles like the recently released Hollow Body as well as Crow Country. So, in the spirit of Halloween, I thought I'd take a look back on another survival horror franchise that, to be honest, I'm a bit surprised hasn't gotten a re-release or, a remake. Released all the way back in 2004, developed and published by Midway Games, The Suffering was a horror action game that saw the player take control of Torque, an inmate at a maximum security prison, convicted of murdering his wife and 2 sons.
I heard he killed his old lady and kids. Sick motherfucker.
Be quiet, you jerry-curled fool.
And over the course of the game, the truth about what happened to his family is slowly unraveled as you fight monsters and navigate the different parts of the island that the prison is on.
How can you live with yourself?
Torque is an unvoiced protagonist, and so a lot of the story is through memory flashbacks and hallucinaries. Torque is an unvoiced protagonist, and so a lot of the story is told through memory flashbacks and hallucinations that torment Torque.
You've been trapped your whole life, T. You've got to be strong to be free.
And you're going to see a lot of these as the game goes on. There's also a main antagonist in the form of Dr. Killjoy, a sadistic doctor residing in a mental hospital that also resides on the island. And this guy is always in the form of a projection, with him literally being projected so he can spout his best Vincent Price impersonation at you.
At last, you have made it to the climax of this fine performance. Let me introduce our newest player.
Hello. I'm Butch. Hey, dishy hair. Can't wait to get my hands on it. Who's this great big beautiful thing with you? Is he yours?
And I think the story is serviceable enough, giving a solid foundation to the setting and the theme, but it doesn't have a whole lot going on with it. The writing is super light and often shallow, in the way that a lot of games in the mid-2000s were.
Shut your cracker ass, goose.
But that's okay, because where the suffering really shines is in the gameplay. Being an action horror game similar to Resident Evil 4, the player's going to be doing a lot of shooting and killing monsters. And this actually came out before Resident Evil 4 really popularized that over-the-shoulder camera angle, so the camera is placed a bit higher up, offering a wider field of vision. And I think too, what really set it apart is that with the press of a button, you can swap to a first-person camera, complete with reload animations for all of the weapons. And either of these perspectives work for all situations, with some of them being better suited for specific situations, sure, but you're never forced to use one or another if you don't want to. And so I would often find myself swapping between each one whenever I felt it best to use one over another.
How you like it now?
Like, when I was indoors, I found it more useful to be in first person to get a better look at the environment, but outdoors, when enemies can come from different directions, I'd swap to that third person view to get a better field of vision. I do feel like first person wasn't given enough attention, however, with the only animations it really having being those reload animations. Whenever you open lockers or press buttons, they do it automatically, but in third person, Torque actually has an animation to do those things. And the same goes for climbing, as well as pushing or pulling objects. And Torque also has the ability to roll left and right in third person, but can't do those in first person. And I do get that rolling in first person might make players a bit motion sick, but they could have added a dash or a side jump to have at least some maneuverability. But even with that complaint, I found myself really surprised at just how well The Suffering plays in 2024. Like, think of an older game you really like, right? Like, I love Resident Evil 4. It's maybe my favorite game of all time. But even I can admit that while I love the controls, to a new player, they probably seem archaic with that stop and pop gameplay. Leon can't run and reload, he can't move and shoot, and the camera can't be moved in a full 360 degrees around him. And all of these are issues that have been addressed in the remake, but you can do all of these things in The Suffering, as well as swap to that first person view. The game also ran really smoothly for the most part, with all of my problems really being bugs, like one that made the screen have this nauseating blur effect. And I think this is supposed to happen during those hallucinations, but they just stay on screen and the only way to get rid of them is to reload a save or just restart the game. It also crashed on me a few times, resulting in me having to replay like 15 to 20 minutes at a time. Because while the game does have checkpoints in case you die, there's no autosave during levels. So if you do die and the game crashes, you're just kind of fucked. But when the suffering isn't acting up, it's a great time, honestly, and I was just really surprised at that. Like I said earlier, you're going to be doing a lot of shooting, and whether it be in first or third person, it's a lot of fun and super satisfying. You'll start with a basic prison shiv, and pretty soon you'll get a revolver, which can be dual wielded, as well as a shotgun, a Tommy gun, a fire axe, as well as throwables like Molotov cocktails, flashbangs, and grenades.
How can you live with yourself?
And all of these are pretty fun to use, with the revolvers and the shotgun being some of my favorites. The revolvers deal out pretty decent damage and can fire about as fast as you can pull the trigger, and the shotgun can blast body parts off of enemies and usually puts them down in 2 to 3 shots. And I also want to point out that the Molotov cocktails aren't just generic looking bottles with a rag, but are clearly supposed to be like Jack Daniel's whiskey bottles. And I just thought that was a really creative touch. And speaking of creative, the enemy design is super cool.
Well done, sir.
Torque has to fight his own personal demons in the form of the guilt for the death of his family, but also he has to fight actual demons.
What is that? What the fuck is that?
And each enemy takes the form of a type of execution, from the common slayers having blades for limbs representing, like beheading, to marksmen and mainliners representing a firing squad and lethal injection respectively. Then there are the Noosemen, Festers, Inferna, and Burrowers. The Noosemen are enemies hiding in bloodstains on the ceilings who come down and grab Torque, and the Festers are these big fat boys who can only be taken out with fire or melee. And neither of these are too bad to deal with, but the Burrowers and Inferna are just real assholes. The Burrowers are enemies who, as the name implies, burrow underground and pop up to knock Torque flat on his ass. And the best way to deal with these guys is to stun lock them with the shotgun. And the Inferno are these little girls who turn into flying fire ghosts and leave trails that can burn Torque. And these are just the worst. Like, not only are they tough, but they're super fast and deal a ton of damage. And on top of that, you have to destroy their ashes to kill them permanently, making them take up even more ammo.
We're fucked! We are so fucked!
I also have to mention that on top of the weapons that Torque gets, Torque can also turn into a monster after killing enough enemies. He can do a combo of fast attacks as well as a dash that insta-kills most enemies. And a ground pound that does damage to all nearby enemies. And you'll actually be using this quite a bit, especially when the game starts throwing a ton of enemies at you all at once. But you can't stay in this form forever, and if you stay in it too long, your health starts to drain. And the game never explicitly tells you why Torque can do this, but it doesn't really need to. The island of Carnate is already filled with monsters, ghosts, and Vincent Price wannabes.
Stop it, please. You're making me sick.
Why do you turn
Please.
away?
Please.
Why do you turn away?
So just add this to the list of things to figure out later. And look, I've made it all this way without even mentioning the level design, because it's as basic as it really got in the mid-2000s.
Fuck, man. You're a killing machine.
You progress through fairly linear levels, shooting all the monsters and pressing buttons to open doors. Occasionally, you'll have to push or pull a crate into place to block like water flow or to get to a higher place, but these are pretty rare. Locations are also pretty bland, mostly taking place within the prison, but the real standout is when you get to the asylum. And here you have to navigate the halls and shoot out projectors that block doors. And like, not only is it a nice change of place to have an environment you get to backtrack through, but you also meet Sergey, and this guy's a real one, let me tell you.
Impressive. Very nice.
But Sergey's not the only person you'll meet. Throughout the game, you'll meet several NPCs that you can either help, hinder, or kill, and doing one or the other can lead to a good or bad ending. And being the goody little two-shoes I am,
You're goody little two-shoes. You're goody little two-shoes, goody little two-shoes.
I obviously got the good ending. So, after playing through the game, I really found myself thinking about how much innovation and creativity we really saw during that generation of gaming, with some games, again, like Resident Evil 4, even setting the blueprint for how future games are developed. And luckily for me, there was more suffering, because in 2005, Midway released the sequel, Ties That Bind.
Sad, isn't it?
And I really do have mixed feelings about it. Ties That Bind takes place immediately after the first game, taking off where the cutscene ends, and it sees Torque return to Baltimore amongst a larger outbreak of these monsters.
Oh, Jesus, look at Lenny! Why didn't you save Lenny? Stupid motherfucker!
Oh, Lenny!
Instead of navigating a prison and an island, you're navigating the city streets, buildings, sewers, and so on. And as far as presentation goes, Ties That Bind is a step up in basically every way.
Where your head at? I'm talking to you.
Character models look better, especially in regards to facial expressions. Weapons are more detailed, and weapon reloads are cleaner, and environments have a lot more features and details. What I actually would like to say is that I really love how games looked in the mid-2000s. Like, I don't know what it is, but everything from the textures on surfaces to how skyboxes looked, I just find it all really aesthetically pleasing. And like, sure, I know it doesn't look good, you know, with games being held back by the hardware that they were on, but I just found myself going back to games like Fear and San Andreas and really appreciating how everything looked.
A number 9 large, a number 6 with extra dip.
But visuals aside, Ties That Bind is almost a one step forward, two steps back sort of situation. In the first game, you had a whole arsenal at your disposal, but in Ties That Bind, you can only hold 2 weapons at a time. And what's really odd is that you hold even less ammo for those weapons than you did in the first game, but you probably do a lot more shooting. And the game has more weapons to choose from, with a lot of weapons returning, like the shotgun and the Tommy gun.
You can be back in our
But then also introducing plenty of new ones like the pistol, scorpions, a grease gun, and sawed-off shotguns. And there are also an assortment of melee weapons like a pipe, a baseball bat, a knife. But since you can only hold 2 weapons and ammo isn't as available as it was in that first game, you'll probably have to keep a melee weapon with you to keep from running out of ammo and just being defenseless. And funnily enough, it's like the developers knew this, because all over the city there are random weapon crates with infinite ammos. There are random weapon crates with infinite ammo for a specific weapon. It's almost like they knew the player would run out of ammo constantly and be reduced to fighting off monsters from hell with what is essentially just a big stick. And while they kept being able to swap between third and first person at any time, they didn't add in any of those first-person animations, still having the camera swap back to third for certain situations if you're already in first person. And that's a shame, because the new weapons and improved visuals really make for just a better first-person shooter. The game also keeps a lot of the enemies from the first, as well as adding new ones. But some of the returning ones have had a bit of a change for the worst, I think. Like, the Inferna are back, but instead of being creepy little girls, they're just generic little demon monsters. And the mainliners, which were a physical manifestation of lethal injection in the first game, are instead a representation of drug use here, appearing in this apartment full of users. And I think that's actually a good lead-in to this game really just being a product of its time, often being edgy for the sake of edge. And like, while edging in 2024 is pretty popular with the youths,
Why you boring me? I'm right.
in the mid-2000s it really is just kinda cringe. It's like these games wanted to one-up each other in terms of excessive violence and themes, even if it was a bit unwarranted. Like, I get Manhunt, right? The whole premise is edgy. but you kind of knew that when you go in to play it. The Suffering has some pretty adult themes, like dealing with trauma and the ethics of the prison system.
A likely story. The needle's too good for him. Filthy inmate. They should all die.
But in Ties That Bind, there's some bits that are just needlessly over the top, like this bit in the junkie apartment.
Hey, man. What are you doing there on the floor?
Brother,
There's also a demon that was an apparent slave catcher, and the first game had a part with a crashed slave ship, but it kind of made sense there. A ship crashed into the rocks, killing everyone on board. But this guy is just kind of over the top for the sake of being edgy.
You cannot hide the truth. You are property, slave, and I return property to its rightful owner.
And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I think there's a charm in the grittiness and the edge that games like this wanted to have, but what I'm trying to get at is that this is just clearly a product of its time when games were really trying to appeal to a main demographic of young men. And to be fair, it worked. I love stuff like this, even as a Gen Zer.
I want to watch The Simps.
Get inside the cave, I'm being deadass.
I was the main demographic for games like Manhunt and The Suffering.
Why are we edging?
Why do you think? End of the grind.
So the gameplay is a bit worse, and the visuals are actually a lot better than the first, but I think it's the bugs that really sink this one.
What the hell is that?
Ties That Bind is an absolute mess on PC, with visual glitches, terrible NPC pathing, and frequent crashing. Ties That Bind really does just have that stink of being a poorly optimized PC port.
Now, my man, Tor, you want Blackmore.
And maybe it was the game saving me from another hour or two of time I could better spend doing literally anything else. But towards the end, the game got to a crash that I couldn't get past. So unlike the first game, this one I actually couldn't finish. Except also, unlike the first, I didn't really want to.
Game's over. Finish these losers.
And like, what I find funny is that I used to rent Ties That Bind for my PS2 back in the day, and I couldn't get past a specific part because the disc was so scratched up. And even after trying everything I could, including smearing the scratch with fucking toothpaste, it's funny to be presented with the same situation almost 20 years later. Like, I actually can't help but laugh. And even after dealing with all that bullshit, I'm still a bit surprised that we haven't seen a new game or a remake. And I know how a lot of people feel about remakes, I get it, but I don't necessarily see them as all bad. So I think this franchise deserves a remake like Resident Evil. And remakes like Destroy All Humans, and especially Silent Hill 2, prove that the 2000s edge can definitely be carried over into a more modern gaming landscape.
Whatever you say, my insatiable alien loves are. Wake me up when you're ready for re-entry.
Come again.
And I think it's especially important now that the games have actually been delisted. Game preservation is extremely important, and I think it's important to make games available and accessible to anyone. So if they're going to be delisted, a remaster or remake would be nice. And even with all the bullshit in Ties That Bind, I kind of think that everyone should be able to experience The Suffering.
Game's over. Finish these losers.